Mr. Matt Darling. Welcome to the interview. Do you want to give a quick introduction about yourself, and then we can get the show on the road?
Sounds great. Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Sid. I'm Matt Darling. I'm an employment policy fellow at the Niskanen Center. Before that, I was working at Ideas 42. So I do a lot of work on behavioral economics, labor economics, sometimes the combination of the two. Right now, because of the sort of weird situation, the economy is in a lot of sort of sideline macroeconomics, but thinking about economic policy and how to make it better.
Cool. Thank you for that quick introduction. Let's get started on this. So basically, today's kind of timeline is that we're going to talk about UI reform a little bit, then we're going to talk about full employment, and then just a couple of fun questions to keep the fan base happy. So let's
Sounds
start off
great.
with
Sounds
some
great.
UI reform questions. So before we even get into it, do you mind walking us through what happened to UI last year with the boosting of the benefit from the pandemic unemployment assistance and the pandemic emergency unemployment compensation programs, and the cliff that people faced when it was revoked last September, and what kind of salient lessons you take away from its impact?
Yeah, sounds great. So when you say last year, let's go back even further. Let's do 2 years, because yeah, we so for the future people watching this podcast, we're doing this in February 2022, and sort of reacting to a lot of the things that have happened in the 2020 coronavirus pandemic. But so let's even go back to pre-pandemic. Like unemployment insurance exists. But it's fairly hard for people to actually access. I think about 25% of people who are unemployed actually receive it. And it's fairly stingy, right? It's about a 40% replacement rate. So when you lose your job, you go and get unemployment insurance, and it depends state to state, but they said, 40% is around the average. So the pandemic's happening, and the Senate is sort of going and saying, "Oh my gosh, like everyone is going to lose their job next month." But not everyone, but like, I think it ended up being like 20% of people were unemployed for briefly. And they said, okay, we clearly our sort of normal Band-Aid UI policy is just not going to be effective. And so they did a whole bunch of things. I want to focus on two policies that most direct. So the first one, which I think you mentioned, pandemic unemployment assistance, is PUA. And what this did is it made UI accessible to a lot of folks who normally would not be eligible for it, right? Normally you get UI sort of, through the taxes paid by your employer. But if you're a gig economy worker, if you're, like an ordained minister, like you're actually not normally eligible for unemployment insurance under the current system, and they wanted to make sure that people could get it. And so they said, okay, we're going to have this special program for folks like that. The other thing that they did is a program called FPUC, or Federal Pandemic Unemployment Compensation. And what this did is they added $600 a week to the normal unemployment insurance. Now, this is a huge debate when there's happening in Congress, because $600 a week is a lot of money. It's about, it's equivalent to a $15 an hour per job. And a lot of folks were saying, well, we shouldn't do that. What we should do is, replace 80% of their wages or 100% of their wages instead. And the reason they went with $600 is that you literally couldn't program the computers to do wage replacement. The UI code, which is, was written in like the 1970s, when they first, like the first computers were basically used to do this. And like they update it legislatively every once in a while where they say, hey, change it to this and this and this. But like it's just like this massively unclean code that's awful. You're like, listen, we can't actually go and set it 100 replacement rate. We're just going to add $600 at the end. So like, the idea was here that they wanted to help people through the initial shocks of the pandemic and support them later. Now, of course, no one knew at the time, I think, like how long the pandemic would last. And we're obviously still in it right now. And so at first they were like, okay, we'll do $600 for 4 months. That should be enough. And then that expired, and unemployment was still fairly high. Trump did an extension in that fall using some FEMA money. So FEMA has lots of like disaster recovery money, and so he was able to do some shenanigans where some states gave people an additional $300 a week. So that you went down from $600 a week. That lasted through the election, and then when Biden became president, they passed the American Rescue Plan, and that brought it back up to 300 a week across all states. And that was supposed to last us through September. And then UI is run via the states, so a lot of states actually started withdrawing it from it in May. And I think about 26 states in all did total. So about half the states, basically all the red states did, none of the blue states. It was a nice even division there. And and now of course in September they all sort of had gone in, and the Biden administration made some sort of like half-assed, maybe you should do something else about it, but nothing really has happened for the last 4 or 5 months on this. Your last sort of question was sort of like, what are the salient impacts lessons we can take? So one thing I'll note first is that people were really concerned when they started this program that it was going to be just scar the labor market forever, or like people were just not going to work anymore because they were receiving UI. And one thing that's interesting is like, we don't really see that. And it's funny, people kind of try to meme that into existence, but it just like is not there in the data. All the states that withdrew early, you don't actually see their employment numbers grow faster than states that didn't. Moreover, like just in general, like the economic recovery, including when UI was active, was pretty robust. Because UI, in addition to supplementing people's incomes, it was classic Keynesian aggregate demand management, made sure that income flows stayed. That said, I wouldn't necessarily like say that that's like a salient thing that you have to think about in the future. Like the pandemic is very unique, abnormal times. There were unique reasons people couldn't work, or anything like that. So I wouldn't say like this means like, oh, we can do $600, unemployment forever. But it is interesting in terms of thinking about normal circumstances. But I do think that what this really did drive home is like the weakness in the UI system. That like when we actually had this big emergency, the UI system that we had was just non-functional, and they had to do all this sort of fly-by-night legislation and all these like iterative band-aids to make it work.
I think that's a really excellent answer. I think one of the things that I remember a lot from the discourse of like a couple months ago was that, well, kicking these people off UI didn't really combat whatever disemployment effects were happening. And I think one of the things that I wanted to get your opinion on this too, is that people tend to like essentialize work a lot, as in it's just about the income. But there's a whole wealth of evidence that work is like a lot more than that, right? There's a lot more like carrots you can give people than just a stick. Like work is a way to kind of make meaning in your life. It's a kind of way to keep even things like your literacy rates up and be part of your community. So I think people genuinely do want to work. I don't think it's do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I agree with that, but I'll add a caveat too, because like I think sometimes people sort of take that logic too far and say like, oh, like yeah, I think people people do not want to just like lie around all day and not do anything. And like work is valued. And so like I do think that you can do that. At the same time, like when people say like, oh, there's value in work, like some work there is, right? Like I've definitely had jobs that I would be doing something very similar to my own job. Like if someone just paid me without it, I'd be like, oh, I would still be posting stuff on Twitter and writing articles to argue with people and stuff like that. That's just part of who I am. On the other hand, I've had crappy jobs in the past where I'm like, yeah, like this is not I'm not getting social value or dignity from this, and so you have to think about it both ways. But I do think that like people were tremendously worried that people would just sort of stop working altogether, and that just didn't happen. And part of this is that sort of thing that people do. There is some sort of social meaning. The other thing that I sort of talked about a lot using my sort of behavioral economics hat is like, people they think in the long term, and workers do this. And if you say like, hey, we have this temporary UI program where you're going to get a bunch of money, people are not going to say like, oh, well, I'm going to quit my job and get that, because they know that like they'd rather have a job over the long term. That having a job is sort of valuable in that sort of option of, it's something where you have, you get money routinely for a long period of time, and not this like, hey, maybe Congress extends this, maybe it doesn't, sort of deal that actually ended up happening.
Yeah, I think that's a solid answer. But anyway, to step back and keep going. So, one of the things they talked about was that, this UI system was kind of cobbled together in the wake of, an unexpected global pandemic. But in your opinion, what does the UI system, why does the UI system as it exists, like, why does it need reform?
Great question. I can think of a couple things. So let's sort of start with, no one gets it, right? Like I said, like 25% of people who are unemployed receive UI, and that's pathetic. And I know you guys are big fans of universalism here, but like, a good program in the United States, like EITC, is like, oh yeah, we got 85% take-up rates, right? Of 85% of people who are eligible got it. UI is sort of at the bottom of the barrel. It's 25%. And a lot of this is the way it's sort of built around denial. Like this is a big thing in like the Florida program where they just said like, hey, what we're going to do is we're going to make the website to get UI incredibly crappy and like make it so that people are really dissuaded from doing this at all. And this is a big problem with a lot of programs. Like they like to put hoops into things and say the idea being like, aha, only the people who really need these benefits will jump through the hoops. But actually, it's almost like the exact opposite of what happens. Like the people who really need the benefits are the last ones who can like go and like log onto the website 40 times until they like put in the right thing. Um, the second thing is that like the benefits are just really small, right? It's not actually doing income replacement, which you do see in a lot of other countries. Like it's much more similar to like full replacement. Again, every state calculates it differently in these like crazy algorithms. It ends up being 40-45%. But those two are really important. And then the last one I want to add is our UI system is really, like the system itself is kind of lazy almost. Like it doesn't actually do much to get people back into the labor market. And it's sort of funny, like it got sold like this a lot in like welfare reform in the 90s, like, aha, like, we have these things, we're closing UI offices, we're making American job centers, but we just don't fund employment services that way we should. And I also add like all of these are really, they're interrelated, right? So like, if you had more generous benefits, you'd see more applications, right? One reason we don't see people go and get UI is like, it's almost not worth it, right? Like if you're only unemployed for 3 weeks, like you don't want to spend those 3 weeks chasing down, government bureaucrats to get the money. You could probably, you want to actually go and get your next job. Similarly, like if you have more generous benefits, like there's probably more of a need for, those sorts of labor activation or getting people back to the job market. And then I thought another thing I'll just add is like I mentioned earlier, a lot of this is like old programming, COBOL programming from the 1970s, but like the system as itself, like it's very much designed for like the 1970s workplace. So like, one big thing is like temporary versus permanent layoffs. Like when US had more of a manufacturing economy, layoffs were much more likely to be temporary. They'd say, hey, we're closing down the plant for 2 weeks because we're waiting on orders. Everybody go and get UI, and then you'll come back. Now most people who get laid off, they're laid off permanently. Unemployment durations tend to be a bit longer now. And then finally, like job search has really changed, right? So like, like it's sort of funny. Like I got my most recent job here in Michigan by like, posting about job stuff on Twitter. And it's really funny because like, that's actually like, if for some reason I lost my job, like that's exactly what I should almost do, is like go out and like try to build a brand for myself and like post a bunch of stuff on Twitter. And it's really funny, like that would not count for like work search in the way you are. And not that it necessarily should, I'm obviously like a special case and stuff like that. But like the way that a lot of like work search requirements are built is it's like built around this sort of 1970s, like knock on doors, hand out your resume model that just doesn't make too much sense these days.
Yeah, that's no, I think that's a solid answer. And I think one of the things that you're right is like these, it's kind of like legacy computing systems is like, I remember, my undergraduate degrees in computer science. I remember like these people the developers for this make a ton of money just for maintaining these legacy systems. It's
Oh
absolutely
yeah,
insane.
there's some code that like is used for Medicaid, and like literally like a friend of mine is like the one person who like who apprenticed to the guy, and so there's like I'm sure it's not just one, but like there's maybe a half dozen people who know this coding language, and that's like how Medicaid billing is built, and you're like, it's such a mess. Yep.
We've been spoiled by Python. What can we do? Anyway, so this is the question I wanted to get to. This is one I'm really interested in. Is that okay? So Joe Biden hands you a magic wand, and you're able to create a robust UI system entirely in the way that you'd like to see it. So, what does Matt Darling's vision of the UI system look like?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Let me start with like the less expansive ones that are sort of like, these are the ones that like I think are sort of the pragmatic reforms that I think could actually go somewhere in the next couple of years, and then I'll talk about some of the more wilder things. So like one thing I'll say, like I mentioned eligibility and like the PUA system. The PUA system was fantastic, and that like just it ended up like all these people who weren't eligible, and there's just a lot of them. Like I think half of all UI claims were from PUA, and like I don't think people sort of had that concept before. So like I think first thing is reforming eligibility, right? So one way that I like about doing this, and I think like Australia does, is doing something called like a job seekers allowance. And this is just saying, hey, we're not going to care at all about your work history or anything like that. If you are a person searching for a job, if we can, register for this, we're going to open make a special type of UI benefit. Maybe it's a little bit less generous for you. And so this could be for people whose jobs would not normally be UI based. It could be for moms who want to return to the workforce and are like going around and need, a little, while they're looking for a job, need a bit of extra money. So that'd be one thing. The second thing I would do is, I mentioned, trying to make it more of a reemployment system, right? So the way that UI sort of works in the United States is, you get it, it's half your income, it's half your previous income, you get it for about 26 weeks. And every week, this depends state by state, but like a good model of it is like every week you have to like log on to some crappy website and document that you have applied to 3 jobs. And again, that's a really weird way of thinking about looking for a job in like the modern economy, both because like, going and doing for 3 jobs a week is like not that many, but you're almost like, you're like, oh, what if you want to do like batch processing, or what if you want to do like a lot of networking and stuff like that? And so trying to figure out like how to get better activation requirements. So one thing you could do is something that's like just more intensive. So there's a program called RESIA. I can't forget, it's like reemployment eligibility assistance. I forget what the S in the E is. That's a sort of rename, or it used to be REA. But like, that's actually going and meeting with a job counselor. It's been really effective in randomized trials, and actually like, goes out and gets people into things. One of my this is more on the wacky side, this is one of my big pet ideas that I've been trying to sell DOL for a while on, is I think like job search requirements should, right now they're retrospective, right? You say, what did I do last week? And you document this. And one of the things I would really like to do is make it more prospective, where you say like, you go and you sign on and say, here's what I'm going to do next week. Here's the jobs I'm planning to apply for. Here's, I'm going to do this on Tuesday and things like that. And what's neat about this is that it's sort of, it actually gets you to sort of sit down and do planning, and think about like, oh, what do I actually want to do? There's a pilot that they did on this in South Africa that was actually tremendously effective. Like it like halved the speed at which like people found jobs. It was just much faster. So those are the sort of things I'm like, okay, these are the things I think are reasonable tweaks that we could be doing in the near term. The more magic wand thing I'll put out there is the Ghent system. So the Ghent system, which I'm sure but like most of the Nordic countries do, I think Belgium does, is something where unemployment insurance is actually sort of run by unions. And you could, it doesn't have to be unions, it could be nonprofits and stuff like that. But what you guys would really like about this is it's sort of like it's like a recruitment method for the unions itself. So obviously if you're very pro union, you love that. As a person who's more focused on UI, like what I really like about that is like the customer experience almost side, because like right now, UI is sort of designed to be as hard to get, and like the political economy, it sort of makes sense. Like the way that state, UI is paid by businesses. There's a huge amount of pressure on states to not have to make UI harder to get, to make it so it's effective. And so the unions or the Ghent system is like a nice way of sort of like doing an end run around that, kind of making it so that there are people who sort of help you navigate it. A great initiative that the Biden administration announced last week, they're going to do like this very tiny $50 million grant for like 5 states to try this out. So it's not necessarily full Ghent where it's like done by unions, but like it could be local nonprofits, but like basically like trying to get sort of navigators the same way that there is for like things like the ACA, but like actually say, hey, like, can we actually get people to this? One thing that was sort of amazing during the pandemic, during the very early days of it, was like this amazing internet community, like Reddit/r unemployment, would just like you would go there and you could be like, I am trying to get unemployment. Like, what are the phone numbers I need to call, in what order, what is the website? And people just sort of guide you through this, and just like made this amazing like distributed knowledge system. And so maybe we can sort of formalize that.
I do like the combination of the more kind of utopian features they're talking about, but also the realistic things that you can talk about. I think it's important to kind of be able to conceptualize and flesh them out.
Yeah, and like the first two I have, like I think those are things that I'm like there's sort of legislators who could probably like corral into that. The Ghent system is I think there's obviously it's not super utopian in that it exists. There are countries
Hmm.
that have it, but it is something that we're going to have to be pushing for a bit longer, I think, to get anything like that.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, so I saw a tweet about this today, I think too, which was, and this is a tough question that everybody is talking about on Twitter, it seems recently. Should people that are fired for vaccine mandates receive unemployment? Why or why not? And I mean, you've already written a piece on this, so I know your opinions, but just for the audience.
Yeah, yeah. So I think the piece you're referring to. So Andrew Stetner, who's at the Century Foundation, he's a great guy.
Hmm.
I've been reading. He was like one of my real inspirations for like tweeting about UI to as a job. But like because he had just a ton of stuff in the pandemic, and he just was doing great research. Yeah, he had a piece saying like here. So the situation, just to again the context. A lot of states so the Biden administration at one point had put out a vaccine mandate saying all employers have to get their employees vaccinated. Supreme Court shut that down, but a lot of employers already have a vaccine mandate anyway. So this and that sort of got them on board. And a lot of states, 4 states, have put out things saying like, okay, if you lose your job because of the vaccine mandate, then you're eligible for UI. And and what Andy pointed out a lot is like this is incredibly hypocritical because a lot of these states are the same states that like dropped UI over last summer because they're like worried about labor supply issues, and there's a little bit of hypocrisy involved there. So let me sort of start. I think the first thing to really make sure that we're all on board on is like this is not like a real issue in that like the numbers on this are just so minuscule, right? There, it's sort of funny, like one thing that people I think have a really bad intuition on is like how dynamic the labor market is in the United States. And that like every month about 2% of people quit their jobs. And that's a bad month. Right now it's like 3% because like we have a very tight labor market, which we'll talk about later. But like 2% is very high. It's sort of intuitively high in these sort of ways because it means that like like it just that's 6 million people. And when you look at the companies that have done vaccine mandates, like they basically say like, oh yeah, maybe like 0.5% of employees quit their job, and you're like, wait a second, that's actually lower than normal. That's actually like that suggests that if anything, the vaccine mandate maybe got people to stay in that job. So like it's not really an issue. There's not that many people quitting their job because of vaccines and everything like that. So it's something that like is very much about like sort of the cultural signaling, right? So like the states you're passing this, they're basically just saying like we do not like vaccine mandates and we want to do that. The point that I raised in my piece was really like just about getting fired versus quitting, right? So the United States UI system is very much like saying, hey, if you get fired, you get UI, and if you quit, you don't. And the point that I raised on this is that's kind of silly. Like these are not actually well-defined terms. These are not actually, it sort of feels like something because there's this, we socially constructed them. But like, when you quit a job or when you're fired, it's like, it's not really clear. It's like, when a couple breaks up, like one of them wasn't willing to give and the other one wasn't willing to give either. They couldn't come to a negotiation there. And so like, I think that's really important to say. And like with a lot of these things, like employers just have so much power over you in so many different ways. And I think, the vaccine mandate made that a little bit more clear, a little bit more like, hey, like, employers can go and do this to you and then make you fire you for doing that. But they can like do lots of stuff and say like, hey, we've changed your hours. We are now expecting you to relocate to this other state. And if you don't do it, you're fired. And so like, I think what we want to do is really put out that case, like, yeah, like unemployment insurance is a thing we're doing to, stabilize people's incomes and everything like that, make everything work. And if we try to tie it to other social goals, even social goals like vaccination, which I'm personally very much in favor with, like it sort of just like ends up cludging the system and making it not work effectively. And and you can look at this like all the states have a lot of states have things where they're saying, hey, like if you are fired and like you are able to point out that this is like due to like being sexually harassed on the job, like then you're eligible for UI mandate, UIC. and then they do all these like wacky things because like how do you actually demonstrate that? How do you actually go and prove that so that you can do it UI? And the answer is like with a bunch of lawyers and a bunch of paperwork, and then it takes 2 months, and it just makes the system really, really ineffective. So I think, just as a general principle, like, social insurance is this thing we do as a society. It's not just like sort of expressing overall disapproval, but like, Andrew he has a good counter argument, and I encourage listeners to check that out as well.
I'll be sure to link both those articles and when this podcast is posted. So anyway, let's switch gears because you brought that up a little bit in the last question, was about tight labor markets. So this kind of goes in this concept of full employment. So like, what is your conception of full employment? Because it seems to mean different things to different people depending on where they come from, whatever economic doctrine.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know how this would work. But my definition that I really like is Brad Sherman, who's a congressman from California. He has this great quote where he said, like, I want a labor market so tight that you don't have to cover up your tattoos to get a job. I want employers camped out in front of my office begging for my help and how to hire people who are getting out of federal prison. And that's sort of like, I think that defines it really well, right? It means that we're running a really hot economy. People who want jobs can get them. Their wages are getting bid up. Firms are competing for workers. And this is something that's really important because, like, we're not talking about this too much, but like one thing I talk about a lot is like monopsony, which is employer power over workers in general, which is a big thing behind like minimum wages and unions generally. And like one thing I talk about is that being stronger than a lot of people anticipate, and because just jobs are, it's every job is sort of different, and people, it's not like a perfect competition model of the economy. So I mean, that's sort of how I think about it. Is it's very qualitative in terms of like how you do it. I don't know, I've been thinking a little bit about like how to define it, but like thinking about like there's all sorts of like labor market wedges you can sort of go and see. So like as an example, the difference between like African-American employment and white unemployment, like that tends to fall when you have a hot labor market because it's like the one time that like the discrimination actually gets competed away. Normally there's like a whole bunch of extra workers you can hire. If you're a racist employer, you don't actually get punished for that because there's always a stock of workers. As you have a tight labor market, that goes away. You start having to pay for that, and you see that sort of gap go down. You see the same thing with like things like difference between college and non-college educated workers, is that normally like having the credential is just like worth something even if you don't have the skills to back it up, and that sort of premium starts to go away as the labor market gets tighter. So I mean, those are the sorts of statistics I look at. I don't think there's like any one number that I would point to, but like it is sort of the qualitative things that you're tracking.
I think that's a good point. And so I guess this gets into like a little bit more of a difficult question. And people like Matt Brunig and Chris Dillow have written about this, where they call unemployment basically a structural problem under capitalism, which has not been wiped out since the post-World War II period. I believe there's a brief period in World War II where we were basically working at full employment, but ever since World War II, unemployment rates for the most part have cycled between 4 to 6% in North America. What do you feel most contributes to the inability of the kind of system that we live in right now to eliminate with its inability to eliminate involuntary unemployment?
Okay, yeah, this is a good question. Let me back out a little bit. So like, when you say like, oh, it's hard to get it doesn't go much before 4%. Like 4% is, not necessarily a tight labor market, but it's like, it's probably tightening. And what happens at 4% or around there is like people who are not even in labor market, people who would normally just be, not working, maybe people who are retired early, maybe moms or dads who are sort of like ambivalent between staying home, raising a family, and joining the labor market. You start to see wages increase, and you start drawing those people out. So like something said, it's like just hard to get below 4% because as it gets below 4%, you start drawing more people into the labor market. And the way unemployment is defined is it's the number of people who want a job and don't have one out of the whole labor force, which is the people who are employed and people who want a job who don't have one. And so what you start doing is you start drawing people who are not in labor force into it. But that said, you can't necessarily really hit 0%. the sort of classic way of thinking about this is there's different types of unemployment, right? So like the cyclical unemployment, which is like when you have a recession, when you have a business cycle, that's what pops up. There's things like structural unemployment. That's stuff like there's problems in the economy that are long term. Some of the stuff I was talking about, like African American discrimination, might fit into that. And then finally, there's like frictional unemployment. And frictional unemployment, unlike the other two, is like basically fine. It's like this is someone quit their job because they want to go and look for a new job, and it's going to take them a few weeks to do it, but like they're fine. It's just rotating around. And obviously, maybe you can try to get frictional to be lower. That's good, but like it's a different sort of thing. So those are that sort of back end. Now going towards more of the question that you're asking, like it's really hard to sustain that full employment economy. And part of the why it is what Kalecki pointed out, the political economy full employment, right? And Kalecki, with the way he describes this, is very much in that paper is like, what ends up happening is employers, they try to start keeping with like the class consciousness and maintaining social order. I don't necessarily personally buy that as an explanation. It's fine up there, but like what I will point out is like, as you get full employment, like it gets harder to buy stuff. If you have a loose labor market, you have a whole bunch of gig workers who can deliver pizzas for you. If you have a loose labor market, you have a whole bunch of childcare workers who are willing to work for minimum wage. And then even like I don't quite buy the Kalecki's like sort of social story, but like it is a way labor market like effort on the job is non-contractual. Sam Bowles and Herbert Gintis do a lot on this, but like you can't actually observe effort or monitor employers really well. And so having some sort of elevated unemployment as a threat there is actually pretty powerful in terms of like it is one way of doing it. So it is really so again I don't necessarily entirely by like the exact mechanism, but there are all these sort of social pressures that make it really hard for politicians to say to actually sustain this and keep this going. And you can point to World War II as a special event, but like the other thing you can point to is like we did have like a legitimately hot labor market in 1998, 1999. And we just really haven't since. Like we haven't hit those trends yet, and the hope is that maybe we will this time.
Yeah, I think I like that answer because I wanted to tie in a little bit about what happens with UI reform. What you were talking about, what Kalecki said in political aspects of full employment. He says one of the ways that the capitalist class does do it is that they're able to retain the power of the sack, as in that the kind of UI system underpinning when you're unemployed is just supposed to be so miserable that it kind of activates you into picking jobs you might not have if you were allowed that agency of a robust kind of social insurance. So it feels like the solution to how bad the UI reform system is too is also kind of fits into the larger paradigm of what kind of policies we'd like to push for full employment.
Yeah.
Which brings me. Sorry.
I want to like, and the other thing too is like the other thing to think about is like there are like employers that like where we like to that you can talk about like low road employers and high road employers. Like I've been there's been some interesting stuff on like FedEx versus UPS right now. Like so UPS is like unionized, pays people fairly well, and like built up a capital infrastructure around the idea that they're going to pay people pretty well. And so they've been able to sort of manage really well during this pandemic. And then FedEx, like much more gig workery, less unionized, but then also like haven't like invested in the capital infrastructure to actually be paid. So they can't just like raise wages to compete because that actually doesn't work with their system. So like there's definitely a system right now where like, we have a real chance to sort of, let's say like, okay, can we push ourselves into this high road economy at this sort of moment in recovery from the pandemic, and hopefully we can.
So too. So I mean, this leads me to the other side of full employment is what's actually happening on the job. And so you had a little discussion on Twitter with Nathan Tankis, who's a notable post-Keynesian, I'd say, on Twitter, where you brought up the fact that a hot labor market doesn't really indicate a significant shift in power from capital to labor. That even though the labor market is stronger, employers have been especially hesitant to change working conditions. Can you talk about this a little bit?
Yeah. So this got kind of inspired because Nathan wrote a little piece, a long piece. Nathan always writes really long pieces. But like, there's been it's sort of there's this interesting moment because like the pandemic like economic recovery is a little bit harder to manage to understand because it's different than other economic recoveries, right? It's a different sort of thing. And one of the questions that sort of going up is like, to what extent is this like actually like a hot labor market, or are we near full employment? So like some statistics like really do indicate that, right? Unemployment is 3.9%, right? That's like a 20 or 30-year low. Quits are 3%. So 3% of people are quitting their job every month. That is an all-time high. That is the highest we've ever observed it. And so like some people, you can look at those two data points and be like, oh my gosh, we're in the hottest labor market ever. You're seeing wages increase. You're seeing all this stuff. On the other hand, the employment population ratio is about 2% versus its pre-pandemic value. If you restrict that to prime age, so people between 25 and 55, it's at 79%. When we think we should push that up to 81.5%. And so, it's a little bit hard to read. It's like not this like really consistent story you can point to and say, aha, like we know exactly what's going on. And so one thing that me and Nathan were talking about there is like jobs suck right now, and they suck more than they normally do, and especially the places that we're seeing the highest quit rates, right? We're seeing retail workers, restaurant workers, and you can sort of ask why this is happening. One thing is that like there is this real story. Like right now, we do have a tight labor market, wages going up. There also is this thing where like work has gotten more dangerous because work is now a place that you are exposed to COVID. And so, if you are a person who has been working in a restaurant, you want to exit that, and you're willing to exit that, for, even the same wage, you're willing to do that. And even if you're not particularly worried about COVID, if you're vaccinated, boosted, and in your 20s and everything like that, you're maybe being asked to enforce a mask mandate. You're being asked to like do all this sorts of unpleasant activities, or just like you don't get to like hang out and have fun with your coworkers or something like that. Like it's very different, and it's sort of tricky because like I think liberal and center left folks are they want to cheerlead the administration, and also like there's a real way like the economic recovery is a huge success for sort of Keynesian economics. We want to make sure that like we do say that, but at the same time, like you can let that sort of obscure what the other stuff that's going on. And it's sort of interesting that like people who are more far left, like Tankist or center right, like Alan Cole, are sort of like a little bit more willing to critique on that and sort of point out these sorts of things. I know like I kind of jump back and forth because I like both of these are true, and they're true for different people, right? Like there's some people who are just like, if someone leaves their job because they're at COVID risk and then finds another job, that's not that's bad news. That's something that bad happened to them. But that same person, like because they're more willing to look for that, someone else, like that's driving up everyone else's wages, so someone else might be able to find a new job that is higher wage. This is what is called compensating differentials, and these sorts of things. So those are all things that's going on. Other stuff that's happening too, like I'll mention, like people who are older than 55, a lot of them have left the labor market. Again, you can sort of say, is that good or bad? Probably, it could be good under some situations. Right now, I think it's probably bad. It probably is mostly due to COVID risk. We also haven't, had as many immigrants the last couple of years, so we just don't have a lot of the workers that we have, and we don't know what's going to happen with that. So those things are happening, and one thing is that what I pointed out recently was like, if you look at some of the data that is more qualitative, so this is some work that's collected by the Shift team at Harvard Kennedy. They look at like how many people are doing what's called close opening, where they're working from opening to close of a business, or how many people are doing sort of just in time, no control of their schedule. Those numbers haven't shifted at all during the pandemic, as opposed to wages. So there's definitely a level which, like, if you were really seeing the kind of labor market we really want to be seeing, like 100%, we would be seeing those changes. We'd be seeing not just the wage changes, but we'd be seeing bargaining power that's leading to qualitative changes in life too. And we're not really seeing that. So what we're seeing right now is like this mix of a hot labor market and a lot of bad stuff happening because of COVID that makes it a little bit harder to assess.
So basically, it's important to be cautiously optimistic right now. You're saying it's a definite victory for how fast we've kind of rebounded, and you look at the kind of graphs that we see, and that it has been a kind of miraculous recovery compared to past recessions that we've had, but also that that the differential hasn't really shifted as much as we'd like to, basically.
Exactly. And it's sort of interesting too, because like, what you're seeing, if you look at the United States, like we're actually like compare us to Canada, like Canada has actually seen a faster job recovery than the United States. They've actually passed their pre-pandemic jobs. We have not. But their GDP is lagging us, right? And like a lot of the choices we made, so like, for example, putting so much money into the UI system did actually really improve worker bargaining power and like is something I think is a real success in everything that we want to be attentive to. But like, we can't let that, we don't want to just like look at everything through entirely rosy glasses.
Yeah, agreed. So anyway, now I want to move on to some fun questions because this is the first time we've had a true globe on the show, so we do want to get into it at least a little bit. So anyway, one of the things that's happened, and this is stuff that only people, because all the people listening, that only people who are on the Twitter community will understand. So if you're looking for anything more interesting after that, skip to the end of the timestamp where we have some closing questions for Matt. But this is like the fun Twitter questions. So there's been a fracture in the kind of globe versus sock world on Twitter over the past couple of years. Can you give me your play-by-play on how these kind of movements started?
Oh my
But
goodness.
but I want you to pretend that I'm a 5-year-old and I don't understand the kind of philosophical or economic underpinnings of either of these groups.
Oh my goodness. I mean, so it's very funny. I have a 6-year-old, so I do have to explain like some of this stuff.
Perfect.
I mean, I explain like Twitter scandals. Okay, so go back to like 2016, and there's a sort of like what's interesting about this is like some of these stuff, like the saliency of issues changed over time. But like 2016, one of the big sort of things being discussion was like trade and immigration. And that was like a big part of Donald Trump's campaign, that he was sort of anti-immigrant and he was anti-trade. And less so, it was also like a little bit of Bernie Sanders' campaign, and obviously a very different framing of these issues. I'm not trying to like paint him in the same sort of light. But like, he's someone who is skeptical of trade and he's skeptical of immigration. And there was a sort of a conversation happening around this, and like, in 2016 where everyone's doing this, and like a lot of us who are sort of econ people who are generally, very pro-trade and very pro-immigration, got painted as like globalist shills or neoliberals by, both sides of that thing. And eventually we started sort of jokingly like added the globe emoji to our Twitter handles and created Globe Twitter. So that would be, people who did this were the neoliberal podcast folks, myself, Sam Hammond, Sam Bowman, Will Wilkinson, like folks like that sort of started doing that and sort of started jokingly identifying ourselves as neoliberals and sort of made this, build this like kind of community around these sorts of things and like it was sort of interesting and fun, a fun sort of group. And then like maybe 2 years ago, I think a bunch, sort of sock Twitter was created, sock Twitter being Social Democrat Twitter, and like, whether sock Twitter is an outgrowth of Globe Twitter or outgrowth of Rose Twitter, or like, I think it actually isn't either. I think it's like a cohort thing. It's sort of like people responding to what was more of the argument happening in 2020, which was much more centered on how robust should the welfare state be, sort of started making that community as well. And it's sort of funny, like I think it's very weird because like neoliberal, of course, like it doesn't mean anything or means so many different things to so many different people, right? So like some people, when they say neoliberal, they mean like the opposite of Keynesian economics, like it means like austerity and stuff like that. And no one who's sort of associated with like Globe Twitter thinks of it in that way. They sort of just think about it, the sort of catch-all swear word that some Sanders or Trump supporters used in 2016. And obviously, like there's more technical definitions, like are you trying to encapsulate the state in the market? Other folks like that. I mean, it is kind of interesting too. Like if you like I think some of the more academic like things are like, oh, like when I read this, like I'm like, oh no, I actually do believe in this stuff. If I read stuff about Rousseau, who sort of founded the stuff. He's a German person who sort of coined the phrase, or even some of the stuff that Franco Milankovitch, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right, but he's got a book about like globalists and the sort of beginning of neoliberalism. He's like, oh, like how do you actually like sort of almost make the world safe for like trade? I'm like, oh, that sort of recognizes. So that's sort of like a history of that. I will say, like, you know, it sort of, I think of it as mostly like a sort of fun thing, and where you joke around with folks and stuff like that, and you have sort of like alliances like that. Sometimes people do take it a little bit too seriously, and it's always sort of interesting to sort of track that or sort of see what it is. But like it, you know, it is. But it's also like, you know, there are Twitter communities, and it's nice to have all these little emojis to like identify it. And the other thing I'll add, one thing I'm really excited about is Crane Twitter, right? So Crane Twitter which is sort of reunifying a lot of folks, because it is sort of you know, a lot of folks have been talking about like the abundance agenda, right? So as like Sam Hammond and Niskanen had a piece called, you know, Cost Disease Socialism. Ezra Klein then, you know, built off of that and started calling like supply side progressivism. Derek Thompson at The Atlantic started writing some about the abundance agenda. But like, oh, there's a whole bunch of people who are saying like, okay, like building GDP up is actually really good. Some folks are coming from your sort of Nordic model tradition. Some people are libertarians and are like, you know, saying, hey, like get rid of the Jones Act and zoning regulations and stuff like that. But it's been kind of really, it's sort of what Globetrotter was a little bit more in 2016, where it's like, say, sort of like people from a lot of different vantage points coming together and saying like, okay, how do we sort of solve all these sorts of problems? And like, you know, not necessarily having a complete detente, you know, Nordic model folks and libertarians are going to disagree on a lot of stuff, but like, I think they both are a, you know, the graph goes up, the world gets better point of view of the world.
Yeah, I mean, can you believe people laughed at the Emoji Movie, and here we are, kind of bridging ideological gaps with Twitter emojis? So
Yeah,
anyway,
yeah, they can separate people, they can bring people together. It's lots of options.
absolutely. So my next question is, you know, let's say His Highness James Medlock is elected as the President of America tomorrow. What position would you want in his cabinet, and why?
Oh, I would take Secretary of Labor. I think I would try to work on
Okay.
something that. I mean, that's stuff I've done the most interesting things. So like I didn't mention this, but like when I was at Ideas for Two, what I was mostly doing, like half my work was like consulting for the Department of Labor on designing programs, specifically from like a sort of nudge framework, right? So like, how do you, you know, if you were sending out someone like a letter saying, hey, come to this reemployment, like, you know, workshop, how do you get them to actually go to that? And like basically rewriting their stuff or redoing their systems, similar OSHA. So like those systems I know the best. Obviously, you know, probably like I know bits and pieces of it, but like definitely that'd be the thing I'd be most interested and engaged on. I guess also, you know, I'm sure Medlock has lots of like union friends that he would be interested in as well. So maybe you know, CA would also be wonderful to work on. Maybe Health and Human Services too.
Cool. No, I think I've always enjoyed how much of a bromance you guys have on Twitter. You guys, you know, are just, you know, extremely kind people, and always been so kind of willing to interact with a lot of people. I think it's very beneficial to people on both sides of the camp to have people like you guys. I mean, there's a lot of others on that side too, but you guys are like the most notable ones that are in my memory.
That's good to
It's really
hear.
nice to have both of you doing that. Anyway, the final question is, what monetary amount could the Nordic model offer you to put a rose in your name? No figure is too high.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Like for what I have to think about this contractually, because like again, like the glow emoji thing, like it's not just something that's like a like it's obviously a signifier, but it's also like a part of my identity now, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It you know, which is a different sort of thing. So I need to think about that for a little bit longer. Yeah, so I mean, what I'll say is, you know, everything's negotiable.
Of course.
But like, yeah, I talk about this sometimes when I talk about like work and identity stuff, because like, you know, I'm someone who sort of thought he would go and get a PhD in economics and just like never got around to it. Like I was always doing interesting work, even though I wasn't doing that sort of work. And like it's sort of funny because like I talk to friends who are like, oh, like I could probably be making like $40,000 more a year if I became a data scientist and like worked at Amazon or Google or something like that. And it's really funny because it's like, wow, like I apparently value being able to call myself an economist and like post about econ and labor stuff on Twitter at like $40,000 a year, and that's crazy. That's a crazy amount of money when you think about it. But like that's how much I value that identity. Now I don't think I value the globe emoji as much as that, but like I'm just saying my anger point's quite high.
Okay, okay. You know what? I'll take this to my team, and we'll see what kind of contract we can
Yeah. What's
concoct
your
for you.
it's the classic like what's your rate, what's your budget question. So you
Yeah,
guys, I
exactly.
mean, I know you guys are just getting started YouTube subscription. So like I don't want to, if you guys get millions of followers and stuff like that, and they're starting to, bring in the, thousands and thousands of dollars, like I want to go back to the table on this.
Would you do it for equity? I mean, that's one of the things that you always
Ooh,
hear.
that's a great. I mean, is that not truly the most neoliberal thing of all, right? Is to like, is that like that feels like I would not be betraying my global emoji heritage, but
Exactly.
in fact living it to its truest values. So yeah, if you guys give me a 1% stake in future earnings of the Nordic model, I will do away with my globe emoji and get rid of
Oh,
it. Yeah.
perfect, perfect. So anyway, so I want to get to the closing question. We ask this to every guest, and I think it's always interesting to do this because everybody has some really interesting answers to this. But basically, if you could beam one idea of yours into the collective consciousness of the general public, what would it be? So basically, what is a quintessential attribute of Matt Darling's thought?
Yeah. I mean, the thing I think is the most important thing, and like really like I try to have this define how I interact with people all the time. So I really appreciate you saying that, like, you think of me and Medlock as, people who provide leadership or whatever in this area. But like a thing that I talk about all the time is like people have different models of how the world works, and like that leads them to different conclusions. And I feel like on Twitter especially, people just like assume everyone thinks the same way as them, and then like everything that they say that they disagree with is in bad faith. And it's sort of fascinating to me because like, my first like, one of my like very first Reddit interactions was like arguing with someone about the minimum wage, and like I convinced them, and they're like, oh, like I understand that now. I understand this argument. Like that makes a lot of sense. And like I've been chasing that high ever since. But like people really do not it's really hard to intuit, and it's really hard to live that sort of value. And it's like so one thing, like I mentioned, I work in this canon, like this canon's like a center right think tank, and here I am, talking about the Nordic model and everything like that. But like, a lot of what we try to do is just like go and take people's ideas seriously and try to respond to them and try to think about like, okay, if you have a either given your model of the world, like how can we address these issues that you've raised? Or, if we think your model of the world is wrong, like how can we convince you of that? And like that's a very different approach than most people take, which is just like yelling at people louder and louder and louder. And so I think that's something that I think is just really important. And like the other thing I'll say is like you should also have a lot of uncertainty about your own model of the world, right? Like other people might be right. Like I try to assume that I'm wrong about a lot of things, and like try to ask people questions a lot, and try to like make it clear that like I don't think I have all the answers. And that's really hard to do too, because like it's always funny, like you could read econ stuff for the rest of your life and like never know everything, but like so being able to like to question that and sort of say hold your own beliefs sort of loosely in your hand, be willing to discard them when necessary is really important. I try really hard. Juliet Gallup, who wrote a book on this, like she's probably more of an expert in that, but like it is something that I think people the more you do it, the better you get at it.
I think that's really poignant, and I totally agree. One final thing I wanted to ask you is there any kind of future projects or stuff that you have going on the go that you'd like to plug into this podcast? I mean, we don't have the biggest viewership, but
Yeah.
it's
So
always
I mean,
nice to hear about
one
what
thing
you're up to.
you guys would be really interested in, me and James Medlock are working on a sexual bargaining thing that's sort of like my like I've been in like the weeds of like Build Back Better in the child tax credit for the last 4 months, and like it's really bad that that's kind of dead in the Senate right now, but I was like, oh, finally I get to work on other things.
Uh-huh.
Even though I'm still going to be pushing that really hard. So me and Medlock are working on sexual bargaining sort of like proposal. I'm also sort of taking all the big UI stuff that I've been gathering up and trying to make that into like a big sort of UI reform proposal. And then what I wanted, so those are like the two big things that I'm working on. Later, what I'm sort of starting to do a little background research. We talked a little bit about like trade and sort of social democracy and like the conflicts of that, and like but like figuring out like what would like a pro free trade, pro worker like agenda look like. They kind of combine, like those are things that we normally treat as being in tension, and you sort of have it's just like really hard for politicians to navigate and not choose one side or the other. But I do think that that is actually navigable, and so I'm trying to put together some writing on that, and that's sort of what I'm hoping to do after I get like some stuff on technical bargaining and UI out, and of course get Build Back Better passed.
Excellent. No, I'm really excited to check out both articles. So anyway, thank you, Matt Darling, for coming on the interview. And I hope this serves as an example to everyone online that there's a lot of bridging of the gap that can be done between people on the left and a little bit more to the center left or center. But anyway, yeah, thank you. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you so
Thanks so
much
much. No, this is
for
great.
coming
I
on.
had a great time.